Welcome to LFPL's At the Library series, an ongoing podcast featuring author talks, programs, and events at the Louisville Free Public Library. For more information about upcoming events, visit us online at www.lfpl.org/upcoming-events.htm.
Thank you. Thanks again for having me. And thank you everyone for coming back for our fourth and final class featuring tree rings. Today I'm going to continue a little bit where we left off last week. It looked like we had one new person in the room, so I'll try not to leave you behind. We've started talking about the basics of tree rings and what is tree ring science, thinking about how we use tree rings to understand past climate and environmental change. The second class period, we learned about the tools of the trade, and we spent most of our time outside collecting a core. And then last week, we got a little bit more into the weeds, talking about the principles of dendrochronology, how it is more than just counting the rings. When you want to understand the age of a tree, if you're counting the rings in your backyard, it's probably just fine. If you're off by 1 or 2 years, not a big deal. It's still relatively close to the actual age of the tree. But in the field that I work in, we're reconstructing very specific past events and change that happen in a year or within a season of a year, and that's how we want to date them. We don't want to be off by even 1 or 2 years. That's one of the great things about tree ring science. It's one of the few proxies, we call them, that can give you what's termed annual resolution. We can investigate things down to a year. You've probably heard about radiocarbon dating or other strategies. There's usually plus or minus so many years. That technology is getting better and better. That window of error is getting smaller and smaller over time, but still not to the year. Tree rings are one of the very few things that can do that. And last class, we did end talking about how we use tree rings to reconstruct climate. I think my mic's okay. It just feels a little bit weird. And today I'd like to talk about how we use tree rings to reconstruct disturbance and hopefully branch into talking about some of the applications of tree ring science that I've applied in Kentucky. So just to recap, I'm going to go back a few slides because I feel like we rushed maybe this at the end, but quickly. So starting here, this is a climate reconstruction. Going from modern times on the right, going back to the 700s on the left. So this is a temperature reconstruction that goes back over 1,200 years in time. And this is a temperature reconstruction that was done using tree ring data, using tree rings as recorders of change, and building a model where we use tree rings to model climate backwards in time. The reds are higher June, July, and August summertime temperatures, and the blues are cooler. And this is warmer or cooler relative to the 1,200 years that were analyzed. So you have to keep that in mind. Scale is always important when you're looking at these things. This is for the greater Yellowstone region that this reconstruction was done. And you can see that there are warm and long warm periods, like this one right here. There are very, very cool periods in this time period for the greater Yellowstone. But what you notice about those periods, especially the warm ones, compared to that last little bit at the end. So it's warmer. In a relatively short period of time, temperatures in the greater Yellowstone have exceeded the highest temperatures recorded or reconstructed in this case for the last millennium. And a lot of the warming in the greater Yellowstone region has happened in the 2000s. Now, it's important when you look at this to think about it. I did lose my mic. To think about it in terms of trends. So the warming above average has been since 2000. but the warming started in the middle of the 1900s and the 20th century. So it's been warming out of this cool period to the present.
Where do you want me to actually put that?
Oh, I don't know where it is. So the important thing that tree rings help us provide here is a long-term context for what's happening now. So is what is happening now unprecedented in a certain period of time? Is the rate of change different? Is the amount of warming different than has happened before? If you add in other proxies like lake sediment cores, speleothems, caves, stalactites, and stalagmites, you can actually look at those. Ocean cores, ocean sediment cores, ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, they go back hundreds of thousands of years, up to a millennium. Up to much, much longer than that. I'm stumbling across my numbers. But tree rings can take it back only so far, but then we have other records that take it back even further. And they provide this long-term context for what's happening now. And what they do tell us is that what is happening now is unprecedented. The rate of change is exceptional. The cause of that change is exceptional. And the consequences are exceptional. Humans are actually an ice age species. We've only been around long enough to mainly experience a cooler Earth. And so the consequences for us as a species are exceptional. We haven't been around as a species to experience this type of change before. Tree rings are one thing that help us understand this. So the question that I posed to you right at the end last week was, why do we care about past climate? We have to understand the past to understand what's happening now and what can happen in the future. What is happening now is we see that conditions are unprecedented. And we can understand that now by looking at instrumental data, which goes back 100 years, but now tree ring data, which goes back thousands of years, to other proxies that go back even further. And I talked about how you don't want to use one day or one event as evidence for climate change. You use trends in the data. So persistent trends. Things like the top 10 hottest years continuing to be the next year. It falls into that category. And it's projected that the next 10 years will fall into the next 10 hottest years. We're continuing to break records. And I have here 2022 for you all in terms of where that falls. We still have 2020 and 2016 as the two hottest recorded. But you notice too that the top 10, they're all in the 2000s. So we're continuing to break those records year after year. And those have other consequences. And this isn't necessarily a lecture about climate change, it's about tree rings. But this is why tree rings are a valuable resource. They help us understand this very important thing that is happening. Trees also provide long-term context for significant climate events like drought. And those could help us understand the relationship between humans and drought in the past, learning why people abandon a certain area, if it was driven by a climate change or conflict or by something else. Putting modern events again into long-term context. This is the drought map from November 22nd, 2016. I used to teach at the University of Tennessee, where maybe this was a little bit more relevant, but maybe someone in here will recall what happened in Tennessee around Thanksgiving 2016. Snow. So I'm talking about very dry conditions. The Gatlinburg fire. Yes. When you look at November 2016, and I would show this to my students because when you think of drought, we think of California, right? And at this time period, the southeastern United States was just as bad as Southern California. And it can get as bad. It's not just California that has drought and fire. And in that year, We had the Gatlinburg fires right before Thanksgiving, while Tennessee was in the middle of an exceptional drought. Tree rings help us understand that event specifically in a long-term context. Have events like that happened before in the past? What drove them? And that's in terms of drought, but also in terms of fire. How often has fire occurred in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park? Because if you talk to people typically around there, they would say fire doesn't happen here. I find that here people think fire doesn't happen in Kentucky, and it can. It can happen here. And the trees tell us that. If you go out in the forest, you can find evidence of fire. In the Smokies, really another line of evidence that fire is part of the ecosystem is that there is a fire-dependent tree species there. The Table Mountain pine, growing on ridge tops and dry outcrops in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, is a fire-dependent tree species. Its cones are serotinous. They're sealed up. And they will only open when there is heat. And after fire, typically the ground, the litter has kind of been burned off. Bare mineral soil is exposed. Some of the competition has been removed. At least the sub-canopy and mid-canopy trees have been killed. So it's prime conditions for a new baby tree to come into the world. The seed plops down on fresh bare mineral soil. There's plenty of sunlight. There's reduced competition. And because of those really great conditions for trees to establish after a fire, the Table Mountain pine's serotinous cones, it doesn't let those seeds go until there's a fire. If there's no fire, other species continue to dominate and take over. Now, this was an exceptional event in this ecosystem. It was a high-severity fire, a crown-burning, forest-destroying fire. Destroying is a harsh word, because I'm getting ready to tell you that it's not destroyed. But as we see it, it was. I went up Rainbow Falls Trail at Mount LeConte as soon as it was open and considered safe, and honestly, I didn't feel safe in some spots on that trail because everything was burnt to a crisp. And you would get to these areas that had mainly been taken over by rhododendron and other things that tend to burn really well during these events. And it was just sort of devastating. But knowing about the fire dependency of the Table Mountain pine, and I actually I should have put a picture in here. I went back every year to look. And I do have this post from the park about the Table Mountain pines. From this area sprouted thousands of baby Table Mountain pines. And when I went back the last year before I left Knoxville, they were just a few feet tall, baby Table Mountain pines everywhere. So the forest came back. And it was the Table Mountain pine that had just been waiting for a fire to happen in that system. So fires happen naturally, not always this high severity. That's a long story about fire that we don't have time for really. But tree rings do help us understand the role that fire plays in the ecosystem, whether that's high severity fire or low severity fire that tends to move through. And that can guide management, conservation, decision-making if you want to do prescribed burning. If you want to promote Table Mountain pine, what do you need to do? You probably don't need to burn like this to do it. But if you want to promote certain species and you want to prevent a fire like this happening in the future, there are things that you can do. For my students in Knoxville, this was a pretty close to home event, and I remember being in Knoxville when this fire happened and the smoke in Knoxville was intense. And in that case, Knoxville to the park, that to me seems significant. That's still pretty far away, and I'm being affected here. What has happened here recently, though, reminiscent of this? Yeah, so we've experienced smoke here from as far away as eastern Canada, much, much further away than the smoke that influenced us in Knoxville during the Gatlinburg fires. This is a little bit while back at this point, but this was a date that I was particularly noticing here in the city of Louisville. If you don't know about NASA Worldview, it's awesome. It's a free website where you can check out imagery like this. You can actually turn on remote sensing data, like thermal detection for wildfire detection. You could look at the aerosols, and it's fun to look. Well, fun's maybe not the best word when you're talking about these things, but you can look like the aerosols that are part of this smoke, right? And you can also connect that, as a weather geek too, I like to just flip through and you can just see fronts moving through and storm systems passing through the area. It's really cool to see all of those things come together. But that's why we want to understand climate of the past so that we can better understand what's happening now and how we place what's happening now within a long-term history. The other thing that we can use tree rings for is to understand disturbance. And that can be extreme climate events, but also ecological disturbances, wildfires, insect outbreaks, geomorphic disturbances like landslides and avalanches. I've talked about those before. So I wanted to go through some of these relatively quickly so I can talk a bit about Kentucky today, but other things that we look for in tree ring records and also some specific examples of those. So I'm going to go through each of these different lines of evidence for disturbance and show you some specific examples. So one thing are scars, where there's been some traumatic injury. If you go out for a hike in the woods around here, you've probably seen a scar on a tree. Around here, it's usually lightning or a tree falling on another tree and sort of scraping off the bark and causing damage in that way. If you drive around town in Louisville, you probably see a scar on a tree from a car hitting it. So anything that causes that much trauma that kills that cambium or living tissue in that area creates a scar. One of the big main examples that we use often is fire. And this is an example from when I was a grad student. We went down to the Florida Keys and did some work there to look at how often fire occurs in that ecosystem. These are slash pine ecosystems. And it's a little bit dark. I have another better picture from a more recent trip, but this is the base of the tree cut down. And then you have this triangular type thing that goes up the tree. This is called a cat face scar. It actually gets that name from the turpentine industry. So to generate turpentine, they use trees like longleaf pine in the south along the coastal plain. And they would hit it with axes and others. They would cut the tree to cause it to exude resin, and then they would collect that resin. And it would leave behind this very distinctive scar that looks very similar to this. What's happening here is, it's hard to see in this picture, but you've got these little curls, and sometimes there are a bunch of them. In this example, we have this section, and each of these arrows is one of those curls where it's trying to grow back over the wound or the fire scar. Every one of them is a fire that happens in the past. Maybe a little bit easier to see is this standing cat face scar on Jeffrey Pine around Lake Tahoe. You can barely see beautiful Lake Tahoe peeking through in the back. It was a spectacular sight because everywhere you went, you could see the lake. You had a great view no matter where you were. We were out there investigating how often fire occurs and also how it's changing forest structure and how that combined with human impacts like logging, pretty heavy logging and mining influence around Lake Tahoe has affected the forest structure that we see today. And then what that means for the risk for fire in the future around Lake Tahoe. Each of these, they kind of look like striations probably to you, but each of these is a curl. And there were like 8 or 9 fire scars on this tree. Going back, I think they made it back, so I was sort of the ecological group looking at forest change, and the fire group made it back to the 1500s with their fire scars for this area. Scars can also be evidence of other disturbances. This is an example of a fire scar in an Engelmann spruce from the Greater Yellowstone. This one always blows my mind, and I've showed you this one before. So the tree was about 100 years old when this fire occurred, and then it's taken it pretty much another 130, 40 years to curl back over that. So 3 dots here for people in the front, that's 100 years, and then 3 dots here is another 100. So it's been healing over that injury for a very long time. We take fire scars and we use them to understand how often fires occur in the past. This is just an example of the chart that we generate. We have each tree as a line, and then on that line, the hashes are fire scars. And we look for where the fires line up amongst multiple trees. And we create a composite that shows fire through time. And something that's a common theme that emerges in doing this type of research is that there's a certain point of time. I mean, what do you notice about this period versus this period? A lot more fires here, a lot less fires here, sometimes no fires we find. This is human fire exclusion. So part of that is what's called the Smokey the Bear effect, right? Smokey the Bear is good. You should put up your campfires and you shouldn't start fires on purpose, right? But the sort of other side of the sword is it also just teaches you that fire is bad. But in some ecosystems, fire is good. Fire is a natural part of the ecosystem. So we've been putting out fires, but also we've been excluding fire from the landscape. Part of that includes excluding indigenous cultural burning. So native groups used fire for a lot of different things. They were told they could no longer do that. They could no longer use fire. Or they'd be fined or put in jail if they did. So fire was purposely excluded from the ecosystem and also suppressed from that ecosystem. And we have this narrative of fire is bad. And I know that's like a weird thing to try to contradict right now when there's so much that seems bad that's happening right now with fire. People are getting killed. There are devastating wildfires going on almost everywhere. But there's a reason that we're seeing these more significant, devastating, dangerous fires. And one of the reasons is that we've removed fire from the ecosystem, which has allowed more fuels to accumulate. We've also changed the structure of the ecosystem, making it more prone to high severity fires. And so it's in a way, it seems contradictory, but by removing fire from the ecosystem, we've set ourselves up for more dangerous, high severity fires, more destructive fires to happen now. Tree rings help us understand that because, again, they give us that long-term context. They help us look at things like this. They very clearly show us that fire was frequent in the past, and it is no more. What are the consequences of that? Scars can also be used to look at things like injuries caused by landslides or avalanches. This is an example of avalanche scars, also from the Greater Yellowstone area. When snow comes down the mountain, it carries with it rocks and trees and all sorts of things that impact trees on the way down. If those trees survive, they are left with an injury that they will then try to curl back over. Sometimes you can see it still on the tree. This one has actually a few scars. Sometimes they're buried. There was questions about this in the last couple weeks. This type of scar here, this one is completely buried within the tree. The only way we know it's there is we were able to get a whole section of that tree. Or if you had to core it and you got lucky, you might core into it. So we do try to get sections whenever we can. And so we collected a bunch of stuff that was already dead and down in the avalanche chute itself. And we're working on understanding how often avalanches have happened. And then you can look at the climate conditions before an avalanche. Are there certain things that set it up to make it more prone for an avalanche? So that we can understand if those conditions happen again, that people need to be aware that the likelihood of an avalanche is higher in that area. It's a very popular tourist area here. There's a National Forest campground right at the base of this avalanche chute, just literally right at the base of an avalanche chute. So we need to understand these things. There's a very important highway that's not too far from here as well. They disrupt transportation, cause damage to infrastructure. So understanding this risk is important. Yes?
I know you've heard about that banyan tree that's over in Hawaii that's 250 years old.
Yes.
You said it was still alive. How would they be able to tell that with all of that fire? I mean, that it was still living.
Yes. It would be tricky to tell. You'd have to actually find out if the tree is still putting on cells, really, to see if it's still alive. In terms of its ability to photosynthesize, how much greenery is left for it to do that. And even if it's lost everything, if it can regenerate that stuff. So maybe people have checked on that specific thing. But by looking, it'd be hard. You'd have to dig a little deeper to make sure that tree's still going. There are other anomalies we can look at. This is kind of cool. So these little marks here are evidence of pitch tubes from the mountain pine beetle. The mountain pine beetle is a bark beetle. It eats the phloem, it's called, the spongy living tissue just under the bark. To try to get the beetles out, the tree actually pushes resin out of the beetle galleries. So when you see a tree doing it, you see these just pieces of resin just squirting out of all the beetle holes. It's trying to push the beetles out. All right, so it leaves behind these little resin pockets, little bitty scars that tell you a beetle tried to get into the tree at that time. And if a bunch of them line up on the same year, it shows you that tree was being attacked, but also that it survived, which is also cool. It's hard for a tree to really survive a bark beetle infestation. They're pretty good at what they do. But so this tree too this is one of my remnants that goes back to the 1300s, so we can understand bark beetle outbreaks back over 1,000 years. You can look at things like frost rings, which we've talked about before, to understand sudden significant cooling events during the growing season and what drives those. In the case of the Greater Yellowstone, it was volcanic eruption events that were causing cooling, mainly in September, right at the end. Here, it's kind of interesting. This is one close up. This is the frost event right here. It causes cellular damage. And then what was pretty distinctive from zoomed out was it would create this crack in the section that when you zoomed in, you could find that cellular destruction that is a frost ring.
Like we see in maple trees around the area that tend to crack. Isn't that from frost also?
It can potentially be from frost. It could be from an old buried injury inside the tree, something that creates an area of weakness, which is what is happening here. That cellular damage creates an area of weakness, and so this section will crack naturally along that area. They aren't just in pines out west, and some of these this is from Iceland, but to show you an example that they happen in hardwoods too, not just conifers. A little bit closer to home, we have oak here from Minnesota. So we have the 1910 frost ring. Here's one. This one's in Russia, but this is an oak. Same structure that we have. Both of these are oaks. They have a row of vessels in the early part of the growing season, and then a darker band in the later part of the growing season. This structure right here, particularly this disruption right there, is the frost event in oak. And I have seen this in Kentucky. I'm trying to figure that out. There's potentially a frost event in 1774. It's a ring that shows up everywhere, sometimes as a frost ring, sometimes as a narrow or just anomalous, weird-looking ring. And it just lines up. I'm finding it consistently, not just in Kentucky, but in Tennessee, in North Carolina, other areas of the region. So there are other people who have talked about that year before, but also we're trying to understand it more broadly across space. What was it, and how much area was affected by it? We can also look at changes in growth. We look for two things. A growth release is where a tree suddenly starts growing faster. And I say from one year to the next, it could be like 100, 200% greater growth in 1 year's time. And then that is sustained for a period of time, 5, 10, sometimes even more years. Or a growth suppression, which is the opposite. It's a relatively sudden decrease in growth that is sustained over time. Changes in growth can also indicate disturbance. A tree's being attacked by insects. It's been injured by something. A fire has gone through the system. Releases can mean things like all of its competition was removed by something, by humans, by a landslide, by a big gap maker, one of those big trees when it falls in the woods, takes a few things out with it. The example that I have right here, I've talked about before. This is 1950, 1951. In Mount LeConte in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, there was a cloudburst event in September 1951. Dropped inches of rain just almost instantaneously. And I've hiked on Mount LeConte in the summer and got caught in one of those things before. The trails were flooding like a foot deep. It was raining so hard it would just run around on your face and in your mouth. I don't know if has anyone ever experienced anything like rain like that before, where it's trying to drown you. It's going in your mouth and you're spitting water out as you're trying to get off the trail. We were just, soaked to the bone. Didn't have rain gear that day. I learned my lesson that day. I was never caught without rain gear again. So I know what this kind of event is like. I've also been camping with my husband in the middle of the night. A cloudburst happened about, collapsed our tent because our rain fly didn't work too well and ended up catching the water instead of running it off. So it tried to crush our tent. There was so much water. In September 1951, this big year, towards the end of the growing season, there was a cloudburst event that triggered landslides on the mountain. And this core was taken from a tree on the edge of one of those landslide scars. Right after 1951, there's that suppression, and then it's sustained until the tree recovers from the injuries that it sustained from that landslide event. What's cool about this is this was a landslide scar that had not actually been documented as having been caused by that cloudburst event. Even though it was known that it had caused landslides and other ones had been mapped, this one had not. So we were able to show that this one was originally initiated by that event. So you have some things like this. I've talked about complacent trees before, the ones we don't want as tree ring scientists, that are growing nice and consistent year after year, no pattern. And then you have something like this where it's like really fast. And then right here, it'd be hard for you to see, but there's like 6 rings right there. There's like the same amount of rings right there as there is right here. Then it widens out again. Then it shrinks, like it suppresses again. And then right here, it's pretty muddy, but there could be like 2 decades right there. That's pretty disturbed. That tree's disturbed. It's experienced a lot of disturbance in its lifetime. And it has that like accordion type growth happening. Now, if you're after climate, this tree also might not be great because there's so much going on that's not climate here. But if you're actually trying to understand disturbance, maybe each of these suppressions is that disturbance that you're studying. I talked before about how we sort the signal out from the noise. What your signal is, in this case, if it's disturbance, that's what you're after. So just some examples, thinking about it in terms of a line graph. These are all releases. So you have a tree that suddenly starts growing faster than it had before, relatively suddenly and sustained. This can be a release after a wildfire. So during a wildfire, a tree that survives might have had all of its competition removed, or all of the understory and shrubbery that it was also competing with in the soil for nutrients and water were killed. So that tree benefits. The death of neighboring trees, a release from logging from humans. So humans cleared all the trees out from around it, or an ice storm, or any type of disturbance event that has reduced the competition and allowed that tree to grow faster. In the case of Mount LeConte, this is just one core. This is one of those disturbed cores. This is what the landslide scar looks like on Mount LeConte. I'm doing my best Captain Morgan to try to show just how steep it is. And underneath of all of that, so that's pretty much grass growing and moss growing on rock. And it doesn't take much to like re-expose the rock. So what's also kind of interesting to me is that's like a 70-year-old event, and it's still a pretty significant scar. Hasn't really been much regeneration on it since then. This is just one core from the edge of that scar. And so one thing that you can see too is that it's potentially not just the 1951 event that's being recorded. There are a lot of other potential landslides events on that scar that you can detect. What I had to do, this was my master's thesis, was try to rule out what was a landslide disturbance versus ecology disturbance versus what was climate, and figure out how often landslides had occurred on Mount LeConte in the Smokies. And then getting a little bit closer to home, using growth changes to understand human land use and land use change. This is an example of a tree ring chronology. So this is multiple trees. This is oak from Bernheim. If you look at the growth of the trees in Bernheim, all averaged together, you see what I found. There were 2 trees that had been incredibly slow growing for 2 centuries. They established in the 1600s. So there are 2 really, really old oak trees in Bernheim. Then suddenly there's this pretty good increase in the rate of growth over time in those trees, but also because there's establishment happening. New trees are starting to grow on the landscape, and those new trees are establishing in open conditions and growing faster. Then you get this sort of settling out right around the time that Bernheim is purchasing the land and beginning to protect it. And then as the canopy is closed in, you've got this new average rate of growth. It's sort of settled into a new regime. This reflects a pretty common story in Kentucky. These are old growth trees. They were there when this was old growth forest. They were there when the land was cleared at Bernheim, mining, agriculture. They started growing faster. Some new trees came in during this time, but they came in during those open conditions and were growing quickly when they were young. Then the land becomes a park, and the land clearing stops, and the forest canopy closes back in. You've got a lot of second growth forest, with a few of those old growth wolf trees left behind. and it settles out into a new average rate of growth. So you can see how humans have affected the landscape through time. And for places like Bernheim and parks like Cherokee and Iroquois, they want to understand more about what the land was before it was the park. Because human records can only go back so far, and human records are sometimes incomplete, and the trees could help fill in those gaps. Yes?
If you were to project that forward and say, take out human intervention, would you anticipate that growth rate would return as it was going towards that lower rate?
I don't know if it would return back to this, but it could potentially slow as competition continues. But without humans also, old growth forest also has actually like more disturbance dynamics happening. More tree fall, wind throw, fire, things like that come in and make the system kind of complex. But it would potentially slow, because as everything in there continues to get older and continue to compete, competition's going to go up. It is an interesting thing to ponder, right? Like if this is a regime, this is a rate of growth that existed in a much, much different type of forest than may ever exist there again. And this is kind of small, but it just to quickly point out, it's a pattern that I see everywhere I've gone around Louisville. Here's Bernheim, here's those two survivors, and then it pops up. These are kind of smushed too, so it's not going to be as dramatic. Parklands, Floyd's Fork, some old individuals growing really slow, and then a release. This is at Jefferson Memorial Forest. Then there's a release. Same thing at Cherokee and Iroquois. You have some older individuals, and then there's like this release in the area right when it's expanding and development is increasing in the city. But then it sort of does the same thing as it becomes a park, and it reforests over time. And we've done a lot more actually in Cherokee and Iroquois to actually, through trees, support archival evidence that Iroquois was forest already when it was made into a park. Cherokee was not. It was mostly residential or pastoral land when it became a park, and the trees reflect this as well. So we've been trying to help Olmsted understand the longer term history of their sites, their parks. There are TRDs, traumatic resin ducts. I've talked about these before. These little DUCT ducts that are transporting resin somewhere. When they line up like this and there are bunches of them, it means that the tree is pumping resin somewhere. And it's usually for trauma, towards an injury, either a scar or it's lost a lot of its canopy or branches in some event. And you can find that these TRDs, they line up in their years that they occur, pointing to a disturbance event. This is an example a little bit closer up in the late wood of Mountain Hemlock on Mount Rainier, most likely caused by ice storms and canopy damage at that elevation. So we weren't at the top. We were like working kind of close to a tree line. Where these? Those are pencil marks. Yeah. So this is me. This is my notation. That's your notation system. So when we count the rings, we have a notation system for the actual years on the core. Mainly because you wouldn't want to recount every time you go to look at that core. You need to do something so you can quickly find a year again next time you look. And that's how we do it. So there's just a simple pencil notation system to mark years on a core. Reaction wood is another one. So when a tree gets tilted for some reason, either it's pushed over by an avalanche, by another tree falling on it, by snow loading over time, I mean, what's a tree going to try to do if it survives and it gets pushed over? It's going to try to, go back upright again, right? You can also see this around here just from on the steep hillsides. Anyone notice the trees do this? So that's because of soil creep. Just because of gravity on steep slopes, the ground's just imperceptibly moving down slope. That's why your fences all start to do this and the telephone poles all start to do this, because the ground is slowly moving due to gravity. And the trees are doing that too, and they're like, no, growing back upright again. If it's because it's pushed, though, by something, it's usually pretty sudden, like this one here. It's a nice concentric tree, and then all of a sudden, something has tilted it. It can be, they're called compression wood or tension wood. Compression wood is in conifers. So on conifers, it's on the underside, and it actually pushes the tree back upright. And on hardwoods, it's called tension wood. It's on the uphill side, and it pulls the tree back up. Both of those could indicate the year that a tree was tilted over for some reason. I used this when I was studying landslides, because you could go find all the debris piled up in areas because of the landslide, and the trees that survived that were pushed by that debris, you could find the year that that debris was pushed against them. Yes?
So if you were to see a tree that's doing that, would you do one from both sides?
So you're aiming for, if in a conifer, you're aiming for the compression wood, so you would go on the downhill side, and for a hardwood on the uphill side. Usually we would go through all this, and then we'd go from the side too, as a sort of comparison / control, like to understand this, how different this is from along the contour. So this is an instance which is rarely where we core uphill or downhill. Usually we avoid it, and we go from the side. People ask me about that when we were outside coring, like, where do you want to core? And it depends on what you're after. If you're after climate again and you're coring on a steep slope, you would avoid this, because this is not due to climate. This is due to the slope. You would go in from the side. But if you're finding trees that are tilted for a landslide, you would core right through that on purpose. Try to see that year that happened to that tree. It does throw the center of the tree off, for sure. Because it's not right, and you can see like it's nowhere near in the center anymore. It was when it was younger, but then after that event, it's definitely really offset. We're getting close to the Kentucky stuff. And you can also just date when something died. I've given talks to arborists before, and this is usually what arborists are very interested in. When a tree died or when a branch died. You could also see, in my case, I studied, when a climate event killed trees. The trick is that you're working with something that's dead. The tree that we cored was alive, so I know the outer year and I can just count back in time. If you're working with something that is dead, you don't know that. You don't know when it died, and you have to figure that out. We do that through the principle of cross-dating, the pattern matching that I talked about last week. On the bottom here, we have our reference chronology, our reference data set. This could be other trees that are still alive that you cored at the site. It can be a data set that was built by another scientist that's on the database for your region that you could use. But it's an already anchored in time data set. And you have your dead tree, and it's considered just floating because it's floating in time. You have your ring measurements, but they don't have years yet. What we do is we statistically find where the patterns match. And where they do, now the floating years become anchored. And now every ring in that floating series has, including an outer year, which if you have bark, is the year that tree died. Now, we don't just do it like this visually. I've had that question before. We do this statistically. This is just a way to visualize it for you. But it's pattern matching. It's the way we date any dead wood, dead trees, branches, the stuff that I brought in a few weeks ago that was 1,000 years old. It's how we date logs in log cabins. This is the process. And what's cool then is you can tell the year the tree died, the year the tree was cut down to build something. Sometimes you can tell the season. These trees were harvested in the spring, or they were harvested over the dormant season, which is pretty common, I find, to build the log cabin. Again, it gives you that annual resolution. One long-term goal of tree ring scientists is to just build really long data sets. And sometimes you can do that with living trees. You can find living trees like I have that are 400 or 500 years old. The oldest living tree I've cored was 800 years old. There are trees that are way older than that, but for me, that's the oldest living tree that I've gotten to core. If you want to go back even further than that, you look for older wood on the landscape. In Kentucky, most of the times, that's log cabins. A lot of the old growth trees are gone, but they're still there in old buildings. You just have to find them. So you overlap the patterns just like I did on the previous page. And when you do that, you can push through these overlapping records your overall tree ring record further and further back through time. You can use things like log cabins, logs buried in sediments in a lake. I'm hoping to find stuff that's been buried by flooding on the banks of creeks and rivers. And by being buried without oxygen, it's been allowed to persist for a little longer than they normally would here in Kentucky. And build records that go back 1,000 years or more. This is the trick in Kentucky. I've asked you before, what happens to wood that just lays on the ground in Kentucky? It rots away. It's hard to find that stuff. It's in archaeological stuff. And then my next step is to work with other scientists to find this stuff, the buried stuff that might still exist, and hope that I can find pieces that continue to overlap through time. That's the goal. So to build long records so we can understand longer periods of time. I was asked before class today where the data goes. And if it goes somewhere where it's publicly accessible, this is a Google Earth image of data sets that are currently publicly available for the US and portions of North and Central America on the International Tree Ring Data Bank. It's a little bit of a mouthful. ITRDB, the International, International Tree Ring Data Bank. This is run by NOAA, and you can Google it and you can access these. You can search by state, by country. It's actually an international database, so if you zoom out, you can see where there are tree ring data sets available to you in China or Zambia, all over the world. We ultimately, when we're finished doing our research, we make our data publicly available through this resource. And it's excellent. And this is usually where I get those reference data sets that I need against which I can date log cabins or remnant wood. But getting to Kentucky and what I've been doing here, if you zoom into that map, this is what exists for Kentucky. That's it. There are 4 sites. 4 sites for Kentucky on the ITRDB. That doesn't mean that there hasn't been more research that's been done. It means this is all that's publicly available. But it is driven in part by the lack of old growth trees in Kentucky. Tree ring scientists, not very many of us are here working. A gentleman named Neil Peterson used to be at Eastern Kentucky University. Now he's at Harvard Forest. He did a lot of work here in Kentucky before I came in. There haven't been very many tree ring scientists based in Kentucky doing this work. And there isn't very much old stuff there. So this is kind of the result.
Isn't Lily Cornett one of the oldest ones in Kentucky?
Yes. Yeah, Lily Cornett Woods is old growth. Their trees go back to the 1600s. There's old growth in Mammoth Cave National Park. Yeah. The chronologies there for poplar and oak go back pretty far, a few 100 years. I think oak there goes back to the 1600s too. And then I believe might be Mike Stamball's work. He does fire history stuff. So actually Land Between the Lakes and Hatton Ridge has been fire history work in Kentucky. What I've been trying to do with some of my work is fill those gaps. So these are just a few, I can actually add a few more now, of the sites that I've added, mainly from historic structures. Because the old trees for Kentucky don't exist alive anymore, but they are still there, hiding in these buildings. So I've been trying to use what we call dendroarchaeological data to fill in these data gaps in the state of Kentucky, because we need to fill those gaps if we want to put what's happening in Kentucky into a long-term human climate environment context. To understand our past, we need these records. And so I'm working on tree rings. I have colleagues that are in caves looking at stalactites and stalagmites, people who are looking at sediment records to understand flood frequencies in Kentucky. There are other people around who are also building in new records to try to do this. So if you know of a cabin, let me know. I'm always out to get more data for Kentucky. And usually in Kentucky, if I can do it in a day trip, I'll come do it pro bono. I'll come get that data. So just let me know. Yes?
When you find a cabin, what kind of response do you get when you ask the owner for a, is it always positive?
It usually is. So actually a lot of people come find me. But every now and then I just happen to be somewhere and I'm like, there's a cabin over there. And I try to get somebody to talk about it. That happened at Raven Run in Lexington. I was there for a little workshop and I was like, has anyone dated your building before? Are there original timbers in your basement? So I'm always like looking, but also people come find me. I get emails all the time. So sometimes it's a building it's not inhabited, or it's in somewhat of a state of disrepair. And people are usually like, yes, please, take cores. And even when it's inhabited, I've cored homes that people live in themselves. I've cored ones that people use as Airbnbs. And then there's usually a bit of like, be careful. You can only take so many, right? And you be very selective. Like I will only core the very best logs here. I won't core everything. But if it's out in a field falling down, I'll go in and I'll go hog wild. I'll take everything. So it depends on what, the people are comfortable with, and we just adopt to that. But almost everyone's overwhelmingly positive in wanting it to be done. Yeah.
Do you find that you're going to get locally sourced goods from like cabins than say downtown buildings?
Yes, and that's a good segue. So the question is about cabins versus buildings and like downtown. So for cabins, usually, and I would say almost always, it's locally sourced timber. It's built on site. I have worked with cabins that have been moved, but they haven't usually been moved from that far away. And so it's all like Kentucky timber that's being used. Now, frame homes could be different. Some wealthier individuals that built frame homes in Kentucky had sawmills on their property and just made their own lumber. I found that in a farmstead in Paris, Kentucky. They had built a sawmill on site and harvested their own white ash. something hard to come by now, to build everything. Like everything on the property was built from ash. But it's not always the case. So that's a good segue to the one example, because I think this is one of the more interesting, intriguing stories that I've done here in Louisville. So these are pictures from Whitehall Mansion on Lexington Road. Anyone know where that is? It's a beautiful building. They do a lot of like events there. I did do a tree ring talk there one time. This is an example where I was actually there at a Trees Louisville event. I'm like, this is an old building. Are there exposed timbers anywhere? I came to them like, hey, do you have exposed timbers? Here's something I could do for you. And they were like, yes, please. Next thing I know, I'm crawling around in their crawl space. Beautiful cores. And what was also funny about this is I had just bought my brand new drill bits. We go in there, and they core like butter. Just seconds. I'm like collecting cores this long in seconds. And I think, oh, finally, these drill bits are the best. It turns out they were coring like butter because they were hemlock. Really, really soft, really, really dry. Everything cores better when it's real nice and dry wood. I went to another cabin not too long after, and I got the reality check of how it wasn't the bits that made it easier, unfortunately. It was the wood. But some of these came out, and they had 200 plus years on them. They were old trees. But it was hemlock. Now, we have hemlock in Kentucky, but not very common. This part of Kentucky, you might find it hiding in a cove or in southern Indiana. Most of it's in eastern Kentucky. Not in any way that would sort of warrant harvesting it for timber in this state. We don't have enough continuous hemlock forest to be harvesting it for timber. I tried everything I could find in Kentucky first, and I couldn't date it against anything. I'm like, that kind of makes sense, though, because I don't think someone from this relatively wealthy family would just be like going into sites where you can only get 1 or 2 trees at a time to like build this thing. They were getting this timber from somewhere. And so I spread my search out, and I started trying to date it against hemlock from all over the eastern U.S. And if you look at the hemlock range, so this is it, you can see in eastern Kentucky it's a little bit thicker, but around here, pretty sparse. So I started looking in eastern Kentucky to see if they imported it from there. That wasn't the case, and I just spread out testing it against all the hemlock references I could find. And it turns out, this might be hard to see, here's Whitehall in Louisville. It came from here. Maybe not here specifically, but it came from central Pennsylvania. They're like immediate questions. So it came from central Pennsylvania. Like, this makes sense. A big timber industry for eastern white pine and hemlock coming out of Pennsylvania. If you ship the wood to Pittsburgh, how does it get to Louisville from there? The Ohio River. Yep. And then everything locked into place. That makes perfect sense. That's lots of timber being imported through that route. Questions?
So how did you know it was a hemlock? Can you tell, like, I know you talked about the fingerprint kind of the tree. Is that how you tell? Or?
So, yeah, you look at the anatomy, the structure of the wood. You start simple, like, is it a conifer or hardwood? You know, if it's a hardwood, it's one of 3 types. You can narrow it down. Kind of like using a key. If you've ever used a key to identify a tree or something out in the environment, like, does it have this, yes or no? Does it have this, yes or no? And you break it down. You learn what it is. So what has emerged for me is there's this pattern of mostly cabins being built local, materials, but also wealthier individuals with nicer homes could import timber. So there's that pattern that emerges as well. And that's the instance here at Whitehall. The timber is actually dated to, this is the overlap between the reference and the structure. But the important part is what it dated to, the outer years. It dated to 1853, so it was cut down. In the 1850s, let's skip ahead a little bit. During the dormant season, 1853 to 1854, and that lines up, there's Whitehall, if you've never been there. Not actually how it was originally built. It was just like a 2-story brick structure originally. It's been added onto. They added the columns later and everything. But this is what they thought, built circa 1855. So this was one of those great instances where what you get to do supports the story that exists. I don't always get to do that. That's what I want to do. So 1853 to 1854, these trees were harvested in central Pennsylvania. Construction started not too long after 1855. It supports the story about this building. But now they also know that these timbers were imported. The next place I'm trying to work on this sort of story is Oxmoor Farm. That was another, they invited me and they showed me a couple places, and the timbers looked kind of pitiful. And I looked at the big house. I'm like, what about the big house? What do you mean? I'm like, I bet you there are some exposed timbers in there. Even the person who was the expert on the building thought no. But I convinced them to let me walk around. Next thing I know, we found an attic full of I've never been here before. I'm like, aren't you glad you invited a tree ring scientist to visit? And I was like, they know a lot about when it was built, but I'm like, I can help you know about what was used to build it and where it might have come from and that history of trade and import and those things that are happening. So I've been doing a lot of dendroarchaeology in Kentucky. That's just one little snippet. Some of the cool things that I've discovered is that Kentucky, compared to other places I work, there are a lot of hodgepodge cabins. They just took everything that was there, 4 different species. So that's not common. I go to North Carolina and it's like oak and pine consistently. You come to Kentucky and it's like beech, poplar, oak, ash, black walnut. They're like everything is in one building all at once. And not that this is unheard of, but it's a pattern in Kentucky that is kind of unique so far in my work to this state. So I'm curious to learn more. Historic structures are a disappearing resource, and that's one reason I say if you know of a cabin, let me know, because it's hard to maintain them. And people will own them. They might have one on their property, but they're expensive to maintain, and they're literally a crumbling, disappearing resource on our landscape for our history, but also for even longer than that, our climate and environmental history here in Kentucky. And once that wood's gone, it's gone forever. We want to capture that resource before it does disappear. There's potential avenues for insights on timber trade and transport. I've been filling the data gaps in Kentucky, so it was really hard at first, but as I date more and more structures, it gets easier and easier. Another cool thing I found, and was pretty much necessary in some instances, was that you can date, say, ash against oak or beech against poplar. Because there aren't enough references in Kentucky. I showed you the map. There were 4, and they were all oak. So when you start finding ash, walnut, beech, you got to start trying out new things. And yes, the same species tends to date better, but you do find that some species do date against each other. And that has been very helpful in Kentucky so far. And I've been able to build pretty long data sets, potentially 400-year-old chronologies for oak, beech, white ash, tulip poplar. We can use these to reconstruct our past, but also to look at how different species have responded to past environmental change, understand which of them are more resilient to certain changes and what that's going to mean for those species into the future, and more. Yes?
Do you find that barns are not helpful as environment, or is it more temporary and nothing to
Yes and no. So the question was that if I find barns more or less, usually less helpful. I haven't been able to date very many old barns. They do exist. They don't have as many big timbers as part of it. Like the big beams and stuff are useful. They don't have as many, like a log cabin is just 50 potential trees sometimes in a building where a barn could only be a handful. Another reason that they're a disappearing resource, barns and buildings. What can you do with your historic timbers? To make a profit off of them. You can sell them. So there's a market now for historic buildings and timbers to be used elsewhere. And it's kind of, it's a catch-22. Landowners can make a profit off of something that's falling down in their backyard that they can't maintain anymore. But then that history could be exported to a millionaire's cabin in California. And kind of lost forever, right? So it's tough. And that's one reason why we see some of these buildings disappearing. I see it on barns. I'm on a Facebook page about barns mostly. And it's people being like, I'm tearing this down. Who wants it? Who wants to buy it? Right? And you're like, no. Or like, let me core it first. I don't know. Let me tell you how old it is. And maybe you won't tear it down. I don't know. But I don't want it to go away, go somewhere else. So real quickly, I'm just going to talk about some other things I've got going on, not to this level of detail, and then we'll have some questions. I'm studying the impact of the urban heat island effect on trees here in the city of Louisville. So I've been going all over, and from urban, peri-urban, rural areas studying this. So that's one project that's ongoing for me. We've been starting in the parks, but I hope to expand to just all the trees like the one we cored outside and understanding how it is affected. I have been coring trees at Lily Cornet Woods. So Lily Cornet Woods is a really special place in southeastern Kentucky. It's one of our few old growth. They actually will not let me, reasonably so, core anything alive. They've also recently had a significant wind throw and ice event that did take out a lot of the old trees, and they gave me and my student, Carmen, permission to go out there with our snake chaps on. So we were prime like rattlesnake season out there and core everything that was on the ground. And so we were actually able to add to a chronology that had been built that goes back over 400 years for that site. You can see this sort of puts it in perspective. There's me coring this thing, how big those trees are. I've been working in Daniel Boone using trees to understand moisture sensitivity in constructed versus natural ridgetop wetlands in Daniel Boone, and how that affects the trees and their sensitivity to climate. And they've actually been trying to understand how old the constructed wetlands are and how they sort of fit or don't fit into the ecosystem there. So we've been trying to figure out a way we can use tree rings to help with that. Been looking at tree ring evidence of land use change in Kentucky, using a combination of living tree records and those historic timber records and all that data I've been trying to collect for Kentucky. This is one long-term goal of that. This is kind of zoomed in, but this is one of those wolf trees. Just one of those, hopefully now you look for them. Next time you're out in the parklands of Floyd's Fork, everything looks fairly consistently aged, and then you'll just stumble across this old one. It's just the wolf tree, the lone wolf. It's been left behind. I've gotten to where I can see them. This was in the winter. I like to do field work in Kentucky in the winter because there aren't snakes or ticks or everything that you have to deal with. And also, so you could just sort of look at all the branches and canopies, and sometimes you just be like, there, I can see it, right? You can see it through everything and go find it. And that's where I've done things like what I've showed you already, looking at Bernheim and the other parks. So doing a lot of dendroarch, urban heat island stuff, human land use change stuff. So I talked about how I think tree rings are a tool that we can use to investigate a ton of different environmental questions. So my questioners are always like, can I do that with tree rings, right? How can I do that with tree rings? You have a question. I think there's a lot that we can do by understanding the trees and their response to it. And that's where I was going to wrap up, back with Robin Wall Kimmerer. Plants answer questions by the way they live, by their responses to change. You just have to learn how to ask. And tree rings is one way that we understand the language of plants. And they're very eloquent in their responses. It's an amazing resource that I'm glad I've had this opportunity to share with you all. Thank you very much. Yes.
If you had to guess, how old would you say the tree is that was core?
Yeah, so that was the thing. Thanks for not letting me forget. Our core, I have it. If you want to come look when we turn the lights on, I've marked with pen where the ring boundaries are in lieu. So you can look. But actually, the middle ring was 1970. So it's about 50, 60 years old. When I looked at it, I said 60 to 80, so I feel like I did okay. It's a big tree, and hopefully that shows you a little bit about how the big trees aren't always the old ones. That's one big takeaway. Big does not always equal old. Big usually means happy. And why would a tree in the lawn at the library be happy? No competition, yep. What do you do to the lawn probably? Fertilize it, water it. I don't know for sure what your landscaping process is here, but usually it's maintained in some way, right? It's a little bit different than a tree growing out on its own without those influences. Maybe in the city, what also is pretty thick in the atmosphere in the city? CO2, yeah.
In the city, when the tree roots have to grow under cement and asphalt, does that show suppression in the tree?
Potentially. It would have to interfere with enough of the roots for it to show up. So it would depend on how the impact, the level of impact, if for it to show up. But potentially, yes, I would say that. Things do show up like construction. When they're building around a tree and they try to leave that tree, you might find that sometimes that tree dies. And they're like, we didn't touch it. It's like, you ran over its roots over and over with a bulldozer, right? You have to think about those things. Yeah, even if you're not touching anything or harming anything, you can see the root system is important. So trees being impacted by sidewalks, roads, trails, those things could show up. Yeah. Yeah.
On cabins, what are you looking for? 100 years old or older?
So anywhere I can help. That's the disclaimer. If people are after a question and I can help, I'm willing to do it. In terms of my need for data in Kentucky, it's older. Because we have enough living trees to get us back to the 1800s. So we want things that were built in the 1800s and take it back even further. We have a lot of cool 1900s structures potentially in Kentucky where I would love to help people figure out that problem. It may or may not fill in gaps. But sometimes those recent structures, if they're a new species, can also be helpful. Yes?
So going back a little bit, you were saying that there are certain species of trees that can be cross-dated with each other.
Yes.
How do you best determine which species can be and which cannot?
You have to do it by trial and error. You actually just have to see if they match or not. Yeah, and it has to be a very, convincing statistical match. To be like, okay, I can use these two species. Yeah. Yes, these are safe. Other questions? Yeah, I'll go back first, then up. Yeah.
Are trees affected much by pesticides? Do you see soil in areas where pesticides have been used or anything? Can you speak to that at all?
I can't speak to that, but I think that's an interesting avenue to go next, especially as we have advances in tree ring chemistry. Because it's potentially that pesticides aren't enough to cause enough change in the ring widths for it to show up, but it may cause changes in the anatomy of the tree, or it may leave signatures behind in the chemistry of the wood. You may find that thing left behind. And then doing that over long term, maybe might find if long term effects to the anatomy of the tree do cause long-term harm, even if you don't see it in the ring wisps initially. Yeah, up here next.
What tree species do you think will thrive over the next couple hundred years, and which ones are really struggling due to our climate change?
That's a good question. I don't know if I'm adequately equipped to truly answer all of that. There are a lot of people that are working on that with a lot of different techniques in addition to tree rings. So you have to think about what's expected in your area as a result of global warming. So in Kentucky, we see currently potentially more what's called drought versus deluge, more like hard swings, more variability in our precipitation than there used to be in the past. Overall, leading to sort of a trend towards wetter in Kentucky, more humid and more precipitation. So you want to think, well, what trees will thrive in those conditions? In other areas, it's things like there are going to be more intense droughts and more frequent droughts. An example that I could give is oak. Now, oak, it's complicated always because it's not just about temperature, it's about other things. Like oak actually prefers some fire too. So you can better maintain oak by clearing and using fire because it's not very competitive in a really shady, humid environment. Alternatively, what is maple. Maple's good. Subcanopy, a little bit more humid. So oak likes it a little bit more dry, more open. Fire helps with that. Of those two, oak is more drought tolerant. So trees and other species, they have stomates or stome that open on their leaves and like take things in and out of the air. Normally during a drought, you would close those. The plants are like, oh, it's getting dry. I'm not going to give up any moisture right now. So they close them. Oak leaves them open during a drought. This gives oak an advantage during a drought because it'll continue to grow. The disadvantage is that it puts itself at risk, at greater risk by doing so. So if the drought lasts a certain amount, but then it finally breaks, that oak benefited from taking that risk. But if the drought continues, that oak is more likely to die because it took that risk. So there's again, it's it might be maybe more adapted to grow better during a drought, but if it's going to be a long, prolonged drought, an oak might not be the best because it takes that risk and then it dies. But then a water-loving species also is not going to be happy during a drought either. These are questions that everyone's trying to figure out and answer right now because we have to figure out in terms of, we have to understand how our forests are going to change and how trees are going to be impacted. But if we're planting trees like we are in the city of Louisville for the urban heat island and for climate change, we don't want to plant things that are just going to die within the next decade. We want things that are going to persist on the landscape to have those long-term benefits. Yeah.
Is there anyone that I think would tell from 1945 to 1963 that there were things like cobalt-60 and things because of the nuclear atmosphere test?
So what was the element that you mentioned?
Cobalt-60 and strontium-90.
So potentially through, again, tree ring chemistry, looking at isotopes, looking at those things being left behind in the woody tissue of the tree, which is the cellulose, you can retrace those things. That could then be air or soil or water pollution, other environmental pollution. I gave the example before of how people have found that you can see nuclear evidence in tree ring records using isotope analysis of the wood. This is a technique that's growing because it still remains kind of expensive to do that analysis. But as we find new ways to do it and it gets more affordable, we'll be able to investigate more of these questions. Other questions? So some long-winded answers, I'm sorry. Well, we are it is 8 o'clock, so we're out of time. I'm going to hang out a little bit if people have more questions. I brought the core we took. If you want to take a look at it, we'll turn the lights on. And I did bring, again, some more examples of the archaeological wood since I talked a little bit more about that today. I have an oak from Somerset, Kentucky, some pine from Alabama or Florida. That's from Alabama. And some red cedar we took from a home in Nashville, Tennessee recently, if you're curious. Thank you.